Morning. How's the Bodell boys? Right on. Only happy looking guys in this place.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. And we're going to call the meeting back to order here, standing committees on priorities and planning. Today we have a public briefing on the 2019-2020 business plans. Review of the budgeting plan with the Honourable Robert C. McLeod, Minister of Finance. Before we get into opening comments for the Minister, I'd like to just go around and have the members of the committee introduce themselves, starting with Mr. Simpson.
R.J. Simpson, MLA for Hay River North, welcome.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Good morning, Michael Natalie, MLA for Decho.
Good morning, Satu MLA, Danny McNeely.
Welcome, Corey Van Thyn, MLA for Yellowknife North.
Good morning, Kieran Testar, Deputy Chair of the Standing Committee on Priorities and Planning and member for Cam Lake.
Good morning, Shane Thompson, the Henday. Welcome and thumbs ups to everybody today.
Good morning, welcome everyone. Herb Nekamak from the Nukput.
Good morning, Frederick Blake, MLA for Mackenzie Delta.
Good morning, everyone, and I'm Tom Bolio, MLA for Tuneda Williday, also a chairman of Priorities and Planning. We have staff with us today. Mr. Michael Ball is our clerk, Lee Selleck, our researcher. With that, I'd like to turn the floor over to oh, yes. Pardon me. Also, we have on the phone from Nova Scotia, Ms. Julie Green, member for Yellowknife Centre. And I would like to now turn the floor over to Minister McLeod for his opening remarks to the Standing Committee on Priorities and Planning. Minister McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, committee. With me this morning, I have to my right Mr. David Sturt, the Deputy Minister of Department of Finance, Secretary to the FMB. To my left, I have Mr. Sandy Guptar, who is the Deputy Secretary to the Financial Management Board. As members are aware, the fiscal context of the 18th Legislative Assembly has been characterized by declining revenues and challenges related to aligning expenditure and revenue growth. The financial management activities over the first 3 years of this Assembly have assisted in improving the fiscal situation over the medium-term outlook. The decisions made to date in support of the GNWT's fiscal strategy continue to be reflected in the 2019-20 business plans. For 2019-20, the GNWT is expecting significant revenue increases. As you will see in the detail, this is due in part to increases in the grant from Canada and increased specific purpose transfers from Canada, mostly related to infrastructure investments, and a rebound in corporate taxes and resource revenues. While this increased revenue is welcome, One second, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, no problem. Minister McLeod.
Okay. Let's do that again. I was. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to meet today to start the review of the 2019-20 business plans of the government in the Northwest Territories. I already introduced the staff, Sandy Koglitar and Mr. David Stewart, and Mr. Rob Collinson, my ministerial special advisor, is also in attendance. As members are aware, the first portion of today's meeting is a public meeting. For those who may not be aware, preparing a budget for the GNWT is much different than what we would be in the case of southern provinces. In our consensus style of government, there are business plans prepared each year that outline the initiatives and activities for each department. These business plans are reviewed by standing committee, and the government typically receives considerable feedback from regular members. From the business plan review, the budget for 2019-20, along with the main estimates, are then prepared for tabling and consideration by the Legislative Assembly. In southern jurisdictions, the government budget documents are typically quite secret, and the regular members would not know the contents of the budget prior to tabling in the Legislative Assembly. With the Chair's approval, I would like to ask the Deputy Minister to take us through a short presentation to help set context and an overview of the budgeting, after which I will answer any questions members may have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. Minister, we will proceed with the presentation deck with your staff. Minister McLeod?
Yes.
Okay. Go to Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we provided a short deck here for provide some overview in terms of the context as we start the consideration of the 1920 business plans. So what we'll talk very briefly about is just an overview of the components of the GNWT budget, some historical patterns of revenue and operation expenditure growth, an overview of the budgeting process overall, and then some of the key considerations as we move into the 1920 planning process. So on slide 3, there's a table that shows the overall components of the GNWT budget that members would be quite familiar with. So we start with our total revenues. Our revenues in the 2018-19 main estimate, $1.7 billion. Much of that was about 72% from the grant from Canada, another 8% from other transfers from the federal government, and then about 20% from taxation and general revenues generated by the GNWT. From those revenues, we then pay for our operations expenses. So that's typically the departmental operating budgets. That's adjusted for infrastructure contributions and those sorts of things. So in 18-19, I should say, in the main estimates, that was approximately $1.7 billion. So the difference between those revenues and then the operation side is what's called the operating surplus or deficit. That was $23 million in the case of 2018-19. So that operating surplus, so we start with our total revenues. We've paid for the departmental expenditures and the operating side, and what's left is what we use then to pay for the capital budget. So the cash provided by operations, as I mentioned, is really made up of the operating surplus and then any non-cash items. So the most common non-cash item is amortization expenses. That you account for that in terms of related to your infrastructure, but it doesn't require actual cash. So the cash provided by operations in 2018-19 was about $211 million. That's the money that then is available to spend on infrastructure. Again, in 2018-19, there was about $209 million required for infrastructure or investment as well as financing transactions, which left us at the end a difference in the change in short-term debt, which was only $2 million at the time of the 18-19 main estimates. And that's where that change in your cash position is what impacts your overall short-term debt level. On slide 4 is a graph that shows how revenues and operating expenses have changed over the last decade or so. And you'll see on the bars there's black lines that are separating this out, and that's just to give you a sense of the different assemblies. So you can see, if you go to the right-hand side, the first 3 years of the 18th Assembly. So first, looking at the blue bars, you'll note that really over the last 5 years, particularly for the first 3 years of this assembly, there's been very little change in overall revenue. In fact, during this assembly, revenue is actually lower than it was now than what it was at the start of the assembly. The orange-colored bars or tan-colored bars are the operating expenditures, and you can see how that is growing over time. Again, looking at the last 3 bars, which is the 18th assembly, and it's been relatively flat with very limited growth in the expenditure side. That's obviously made up of a combination of both the investments that have been made, any forced growth that's in there, as well as being offset then by reductions and sunsets and those sorts of things. But overall, the expenditure side has been quite flat while revenues have been going down. Slide 5 talks about some of the challenges that the 18th Assembly has faced. Certainly, significant among those is that revenue growth has actually been lower than what we expected as we came into this Assembly. And in fact, revenues in 2018-19 were $46 million less than at the start of the Assembly. Operating expenses, as I mentioned, has been largely unchanged, but that's the result of modest investments offset by those expenditure reductions. So to give some context on that, if you think about a 2% growth in compensation and benefits as well as any inflationary impacts related to goods and services, that would add about $35 million annually to operating expenses. And that's without any new initiatives. So you can see there's a natural tendency for expenses to go up through inflation and just the various cost pressures that are out there. And at the same time, in this assembly, we've had the situation of actually declining revenues. So if operating expenditures grow faster than revenue, that means that surplus that you use or that you generate to be able to pay for your infrastructure starts to reduce over time. So you have 2 choices at that point, at least 2 choices, I guess. You could either start to reduce your capital spending or increase your debt, so borrow more for being able to do that. And that's really the challenge we faced over the first 3 years of this assembly. So in terms of planning for the 2019 main estimates, of which business planning is sort of the first step on that, there's a couple of things that are important considerations as we move into the 1920 planning. First off, there is going to be some good news on the revenue side. We know because of the way the formula works, we have a pretty good sense of what the grant from Canada will do. And we expect that the grant from Canada as well as the CHT, CST will increase by about $53 million next year. So where we've been in this situation, a fairly significant revenue challenges in terms of growth, we expect in 1920 we'll start to see a little bit of boost there. There will also be a boost in revenues as a result of the federal transfers for targeted infrastructure funding. So the Investing in Canada plan and some of the other programs that the feds have rolled out, and as we've talked about in the past, that's a bit of a double-edged sword because of course those are 75-25 splits, so it's good to get those projects and get that funding, but that does create some expenditure pressures as well. And then people may remember that at the time of the 1819 main estimates, we had some particularly significant events around corporate tax, around resource revenue, and even a little earlier than that around personal tax. All signs are that those are going to stabilize back to more historical levels. So I think we're going to be in a situation where our revenue should be pretty good going into the 1920 estimates. So once you have a sense of the revenue side, the next step in the planning exercise is to look at some of the key components of change. That's going to include any initiatives to advance the mandate items of the Assembly. You obviously have forced growth and collective bargaining processes that you need to budget for. There's often other adjustments from projects that are ongoing or those sorts of things that get included in the budget. And those are offset typically by any sunsets, and there's a small amount of reductions that started in this assembly that are still need to be accounted for as well. The third component, of course, overall in terms of the budgeting is the capital estimates, and those will be considered, the 1920 capital estimates will be considered in the October session. And of course, the federal territorial projects that under Investing in Canada and some of those other programs will have an impact on them. And then finally, depending on what the decisions are made around those first few components, you end up with your change in debt. And our total debt is limited by the borrowing limit that's imposed by Canada of $1.3 billion. At the time of the 2018-19 main estimates, the total debt was estimated at about $1.1 billion. So that included $321 million short-term debt. So we're starting to approach that debt limit. And particularly the short-term debt is one that causes at least some concern in that that's very much susceptible to changes in interest rates. And for those that follow the Bank of Canada, and I'm expecting there's few of you, but for those that are following the Bank of Canada, they've been sending pretty strong signals that we should be expecting some interest rate increases. So we should expect some pressures that way in terms of the coming years. So on slide 7 is just some key factors that needed to be considered as we develop the 1920 business plans and moving into the budget development. First of all, as I mentioned, there's a fair amount of targeted federal infrastructure that's going to add some very good programs and initiatives for us in terms of the capital plan, but that also has some impact with our 25% that we need. The Stanton Territorial Hospital is nearing completion, and so that way we'll need to account for the annual service payment for that as it goes into operation. The mandate items, there's a large mandate we have as a government, so there's lots of areas yet that need investment, and that covers the whole range from continuing investments in children and youth, the economy, the environment, and some of the energy projects, as well as communities and community governments, etc. Collective bargaining with the UNW is still obviously unresolved, and we're going into mediation, but we have to be able to at least acknowledge that there's going to be some expenditure growth there. Hopefully we'll be able to come to an agreement at the time of this mediation in the fall, so we'll have a better sense before we go into the next budget. But it is certainly an area that will need some investment. The NWT carbon tax is expected to be implemented in July 2019. That's less of an issue in terms of planning because it's largely revenue neutral, so there's planned offsets investments that'll be implemented simultaneously with the tax collection, so there's not it's a net at zero impact to a large extent. We do have to keep our eye on short-term debt. It remains very high, and it is a risk as interest rates are expected to increase. And then we have to keep our eye on the longer term as well. While we are seeing some signs of particularly in 1920 is going to be a reasonably positive year, the more medium trend look at revenues suggests that we should go back to some modest increases in the revenue, but we're not going to be going back to the days of the last decade where we were seeing changes in our gross expenditure base of $60 or $70 million annually. During this period, we've been more like $20 million annually as we've been in this downturn, and that may come back up to being in the high 30s or early 40s, but we're not going to be bouncing back to where we are by all indications of the forecasts that we've got available to us. So finally on slide 8 is just an overview of the process that you'd all be very familiar with. Our annual budget planning process is truly annual. By the time we get done last year's budget, we're pretty much right into looking for direction around business planning guidelines and some assumptions and those sorts of things. In May and June, we start to gather up forest growth pressures as well as initiatives. By early August, we develop the business plans that are being reviewed over the next few weeks here. And then late August, they come to standing committee. In September, we're obviously doing the review of the business plans now. We will get the recommendations out of standing committees probably in early to mid-October. Those are then reviewed and any adjustments that are necessary, and then we start right into the main estimates process. By late November, we should have the main estimates more or less developed by departments, and by early to mid-December, those are circulated then to standing committees. And that gets us ready for the budget session, which typically would take place in around mid-March or mid-February to mid-March for overall committee of the whole review, as well as hopefully approval of the appropriations. So that's the presentation, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. And we'll now open the floor up for questions or comments from the committee members. Mr. Banthang.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Minister and your staff for coming and meeting with us here today. And and in particular in this public setting. I think this is a year 2 that we've undertaken this approach. I believe that it's a positive one, and I'm hopeful that as we go forward we can look at other opportunities where we can start to have public presentations relevant to our capital planning and budget cycles. So I congratulate you for coming here and presenting to us today. You know, we talked about as a government in the last assembly about an aggressive plan for growing the population. And in this assembly we've are faced with a number of challenges, but we don't seem to be talking about and or revisiting that plan. I believe the 17th Assembly tried to make a goal of about 2,000 people over a particular period of time, and we can see now how critical that is to us as a territory, because as far as transfer payments are concerned, this is a big revenue generator for us. I would like to ask, where are we as a government right now in terms of our plan to grow the population base in the Northwest Territory so that we can also reap the benefits of additional transfer payments from the federal government? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. Minister McLeod.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, we've not come right out in this assembly and said we want to grow the population by 2,000 people. I think the last government had said that. I'm not sure exactly what it grew by, but we feel as a government that with more opportunities that we put out there, with some of the investments that we may have to make, then the population would just grow, because there's opportunities up here, and if we get the infrastructure projects off the ground, we may need to more people may move here. So we didn't come out and say we're going to grow the population by 2,000 this assembly. We just thought by making significant investments and opportunities in the population would just grow itself. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. Mr. Van Thyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, we recognize that the territory, frankly, is going to, in probably the near future, let's say within the 5 to 15 year time frame, we're looking at significant potential for a loss of population, because we know that the diamond mines have reached their peak performance and are going to start to be on a decline. They affect every industry. And also we have an aging population that is going to put significant pressure on our government with regard to social spending and requirements. So we got to find ways in which to generate revenues. I talked about trying to grow the population, but the transfer or the territorial financing formula, I understand, is up for negotiation in 2019. Can the minister provide us maybe a bit of an update with what position are we going to take as it relates to negotiating that? And would the current clawback clauses within the territorial financing formula be something that we could adjust, or at least have the opportunity to negotiate, so that when we generate our own source revenues, that they're not clawed back through the territorial financing formula agreement? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So just for a point of clarification, I guess, is the territorial formula financing arrangement is in legislation. So it's not an agreement between the two governments. It's actually a piece of federal legislation. So they do a review of that every 5 years. The one for 2019 was mostly a technical review. And really it was to align better some of the changes contemplated under equalization to reflect that in the territorial finance formula as well. That review, or those sorts of changes and the more fundamental issues that the members are raising around things like the offsets and those sorts of things, are discussions that we have all the time with the federal government. I don't want to support their position by any stretch. Their point of view, though, is that the way the formula works, and this is fact, is that we start with a gross expenditure base, which is a measure of what the resources we should need to provide comparable services and programs. We then offset that by our own source revenue, and that's what the grant comes from. So the degree to which we offset those, the degree to which there's an incentive to expand your own source in terms of additional taxes being collected or the expanding economy, those are the kinds of things that we're discussing with them all the time. Their position is that if you're raising more of your own, you should need less from Canada. It's not unreasonable, but there also has to be an incentive, and that's really where the policy debate comes, is to what degree are we providing an incentive to continue to grow and generate our own source revenues as opposed to relying on formula grant from Canada. That said, I do have to say that we've done very well under the formula. If you compare what we get under the formula versus equalization, it's night and day. We probably get 2 or 3 times the amount than what you would under the traditional equalization formula. So it's been a good arrangement for us overall. So thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Mr. Van Thyn, you're done. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And like my colleague, Mr. Van Thyn, I think that this is an important opportunity to talk about how we plan our budgets and how we plan our business in a public way. And one thing we hear often is confusion amongst members of the public around what operating surplus means. And in this presentation we just received, we heard that as operating expenditures grow, it decreases our ability to spend on capital. So I'd just like the minister to explain that principle, and if he can, or his officials, talk about the difference between our operating surplus and how it works in our budgeting processes versus how a surplus is viewed in a southern jurisdiction, where it's very clear that a surplus is a surplus and a deficit is a deficit. It's not the case here. Can they provide clarity on that? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So the very simple way to think about it is that when we talk about total revenues, that's the money we use for everything, whether it's for operations or for capital. So the way our main estimates work is we start with that total dollar amount, and so we'll just call it $1 for ease. We then pay for all the operations, so that's the programs and services, and that adds up to a total, let's say that's 85 cents of that dollar, and then what's left is what we use for the capital project. To your question about sort of the more traditional surplus deficit as opposed to an operating surplus, so in a southern jurisdiction, when they talk about surplus or deficit, it's they're taking that total of their revenue. They're then taking for their capital spending and their operation spending, and whatever they have left over at the end, that's the total, either deficit or surplus, as the case may be. So operating surplus is a component of that, but if you're looking at the sort of true financial or the overall financial picture of government, you've got to look at both what we spend on operations and what we spend on capital compared to the total dollars that we bring in. If we've got a deficit, then obviously that's what leads to borrowing, and that might be planned borrowing if it's in the case of a large project where we've taken on long-term debt, and it might be in the form of short-term debt if we've just spent more than we've actually brought in. I think of short-term debt in the form of like a line of credit, if you like. It's just excess debt that you've taken on, but that you do need to pay back eventually. So, thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So given that, again, so that's why when operating expenditures increase, you have less left over for capital spending, and it puts us in a situation where we have to reduce operational spending if we want to meet our capital commitments or our capital objectives. So with all related to this then, with all of these bilaterals we've signed with the federal government, and like the Mackenzie Valley Highway or the $100 million bilateral plan for infrastructure development and the various other pools of federal infrastructure money, how does that, those announcements that we know about now that have been made public, how does that affect our overall budgeting? Every time when we sign those deals, do we then have to look at things like benefits and compensation, things like social programs, and decrease the amount we're investing in those in order to meet those capital requirements that we're signing off on? Or is there, what is the department's process for managing those investments? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I would say we do all of those things simultaneously. So we've known the federal investment is coming. We had a pretty good sense of the cash flows that would be expected. Obviously, as you start to sign deals, you get more specifics around that. So we've been keeping an eye on that in terms of trying to manage both the natural increases that take place in operating expenses from forced growth, the need to advance the mandate, those sorts of things, balancing that with the known increases that are going to take place to the capital side, and trying to do that without increasing particularly the short-term debt. Some of the very large projects like the Stanton project, certainly the Mackenzie Valley fiber line, those sorts of things, we took on long-term debt to do those kind of investments. But generally what we've done over the last few years, when you look at that cash position overall, is to try to stop that borrowing for operations and for capital that just increases that short-term debt. So if you look back over the last 10 years or so, we're up to about $300 million worth of short-term debt. 10 years ago, a couple assemblies ago, we actually had a cash surplus. So we've been adding to that pot over the last decade or so. What this assembly has successfully done is to stop the bleeding, for lack of a better term. We haven't added as much to short-term debt, and it's because the Financial Management Board and the Cabinet has tried to balance all those things so that we can keep from adding onto that debt and not having a mechanism to pay it back necessarily. So I think that's but it is those decisions of those balance points or taking on debt that you have to leave for somebody else to have to deal with. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank
you, Mr. Stewart. Mr. Testard, you have one more question if you'd like. Mr. Testard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll just conclude on this line of thought. So just so we can clarify our kind of financial structure about how we come up with budgetary policy and spending items. It's not that far different from what you'd see in other jurisdictions that are perhaps a bit more clear when a budget is introduced and people can look through it line by line and see everything. We're not different than that. We just pursue it in a different way. Would that be a correct assumption? Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Testard. Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I would say it's a question of, to some degree, of presentation. Certainly, one of the things I've been looking at more recently is how other jurisdictions present the information. All of us have to comply with sort of national standards around accounting practices for the public sector, so we're all consistent in that way. Different jurisdictions and they, as you look at different provinces as well as other territories, approach how they present their budget information sometimes quite differently in the form of main estimates, etc. I think we're always should be looking for ways to make that simpler and more understandable for everyone. The accountants all seem to be able to follow it along fairly well, but for us that aren't accountants, myself included, sometimes I think there's always ways that we should be looking to try to simplify that so that people can be more clear on what exactly is that process that leads us to either an overall deficit or surplus and that financial position that we've got. So part of that is through the public accounts process and the way we report on that, and part of it is through our budget documents and our main estimates document to make it as clear as possible. So we're all following the same standard. It's really how we present it is where the variation tends to happen.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, my first question is for the Minister. I'm wondering what kind of public consultation he's planning to do around this budget for the 2019-2020 fiscal year. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Minister McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, we have a fairly large mandate, and I think our mandate covers almost everything that the public would be concerned about, and it's something that was put together by the 19 members of this Assembly who represent all 44,000 residents of the Northwest Territories. So we've been concentrating on our mandate, and to the actual public consultation, I did not do one this fall. I mean, this is we're starting off our business plans for next year, so we've been concentrating on the mandate and bringing forward the items that are in it. So therefore, there was no public consultation this year. But I believe through members of the Legislative Assembly, the public is well represented. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for that response, Minister. My understanding that there hasn't been any public consultation of this 18th Assembly, and as we all know, the mandate was agreed to a while ago. So does that mean that people are only going to get input into the budgeting process once every 4 years, direct input? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Minister McLeod.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I think that I believe members of the public have input into the budgeting process all the time. We're very accessible if they have concerns with it. I hear concerns when I travel. The majority of the concerns that I would hear are we need work, and we believe we try and do that. But to say that it's going to happen every 4 years, I mean, obviously, if there's a feeling out in the public that we've not given them proper consultation, then I suppose then in 4 years you are answerable to the public. So we've been concentrating on our mandate items and trying to. We have a very large mandate. I believe there's 200 and something items in our mandate. So we have a very large mandate. So we've been concentrating and trying to bring many of the issues and the concerns in the mandate forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. One more question, if you'd like, Ms. Green.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate the Minister's response, but I want to point out that many things have changed since the creation of the mandate, and the biggest in terms of budgeting is the influx of federal dollars and the decision to forward certain projects in those streams and to come up with the operating surplus that will fund the GNWT share. I think it's important to ask people directly what they think about that. What are their priorities? Does this represent their priorities? There used to be a more systematic way of canvassing the public on the budgeting process and their own priorities, which has been abandoned. And I don't think that speaks well to the transparency and accountability that we all were elected to support. So I don't really have a question there. That's a reflection, and I'm disappointed to hear that the Minister is once again not going to go out and do public consultation on this budget. Those are my comments for this round. I'll go back on this one. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. We'll take that as a comment. Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question to the Minister is, if I remember correctly here some months ago, your statement was that you were going to proceed on with bilateral discussions here, including the TFF and the consolidated debt arrangement and possible increase to the current borrowing limit with the Ottawa counterparts. Did that meeting happen this past summer months? If so, can you explain how it went in those three different areas? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. Minister McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I have had conversations with the federal counterpart, Minister Morneau, and told him we would like to have a discussion on TFF, raising our debt limit and that, and they were he didn't give me a definite answer, but he did say that we will start having conversations. I think our officials are having conversations all the time. So as the number of projects and different things that come forward that may affect our territorial formula financing, we continue to have those discussions with Ottawa. But I have made it known that I would like to start discussions on the territorial formula financing and our debt limit. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. Mr. McNeely. Mr. McNeely, you're done for this round?
Yeah, I'm done for this round. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. Mr. Nakamayak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the presentation as well. Too earlier on, the witness mentioned that the Southern Northwest Territories is benefiting from diamond mines, and with the lack of the pipeline shut down in Mr. McNeely's region and the moratorium in my region, the Beaufort, on any oil and gas, I'm just wondering, as the government moves ahead looking forward, they're talking about diversifying the economy. I wonder if they're they're involving, like the Inuvialuit, the Gwich'in, the Sawtoo, the indigenous people of the northern part of the territory when they look at business plans, so that indigenous governments can actually plan better for themselves as well too, so that we're kind of on the same track. I'm just wondering what the relationship is when it comes to this part of planning with the Northwest Territories and the indigenous governments. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Nakamayak. Minister McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I take the member's point on the slowdown in the oil and gas industry. In my conversation with my federal counterparts in finance and, well, every opportunity I have, I mentioned the moratorium and how, you basically shut down a whole region and not sending a very good message. So they've heard that message pretty well every federal meeting that I've gone to. And involving the Aboriginal governments, we have bilateral meetings with the Aboriginal governments all the time, and they bring forward some of their concerns. Obviously, you have to listen to the Aboriginal governments, whether we incorporate some of those into the business plans or not. We don't share the business plans with them, but they do share their concerns, and if there's opportunities for investment in some of their concerns, then we make those. We would like to try and make those investments. And in our bilateral meetings with the Aboriginal governments, I mean, there is talk of business opportunities and diversifying the economy. So we meet with them and we listen to what they have to say, and we listen to their advice. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. Mr. Nakamayak.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the response. It's good to hear that the bilaterals are happening more and more. As this government comes to an end, there's just over a year left, and going into the next government, I think, it would make a lot more sense for the GNWT, the next government, to build their mandate with Indigenous governments, so that a lot of realistic goals are met within each region and within the territorial government. In my region, there's being on the coast, the water levels are rising and it's showing, and it's actually affecting a lot of the infrastructure with the permafrost melting. I'm just wondering what would be ideal and what would look like next year during this process with more involvement of Indigenous peoples and governments. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Nakamayak. Minister out.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If members may recall, I believe at the beginning of this assembly, we had a large meeting with a number of Aboriginal governments. I think there was a number of organizations represented. I believe we had the meeting at the Tree of Peace, if I recall. And so we got a lot of input from many of the different organizations around the Northwest Territories, and you'd be well advised to listen to what a lot of these organizations have to say. If you can incorporate some of those into your planning process, then it would make sense. As far as involving the Aboriginal governments in the actual budget planning process for next year, I mean, we'll continue to meet with them. We'll seek advice from them, and if there's opportunities to incorporate some of their suggestions into our planning process, then that's something that we should look at. But we continue to do our budget planning process. I mean, first and foremost, we work with the 19 members of this assembly, and then if there's other opportunities, then we'd be well advised to take those into consideration. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. Mr. Nakamayak, you have one more question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chairs, there's more and more traffic along the Northwest Passage. There's also a blockage of ice preventing some ships to traverse through the Northwest Passage, although there's a large number in traffic happening this year within small vessels to large vessels. I think it's important as we move into the next government, the federal government plays a role, with the Coast Guard, with Transport Canada, making all those regulations. As we move ahead, I think it would be smart for the government of Northwest Territories to look at changing their role, and not just in the waters, but along the communities that have ports or maybe share a lack of infrastructure. I think it would be smart for the government of Northwest Territories to start to plan for that and take over some of the roles that the federal government play in the four communities, and maybe there may be more. along the way. So looking forward, I think it would be smart to kind of think that and put that put that bug in someone's ear to kind of look at that moving forward, because I think it's really important for planning. As we have two different governments sometimes work in parallel. If they can work together, I think it makes sense. It's more of a comment than anything, Mr. Chair. That's all I have for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Nakamayak. I take that as a comment unless the Minister wishes to comment also. Minister McLeod?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just very quickly, I appreciate the members' comments. I mean, we're well aware of the increase in traffic along the Northwest Passage. We've had those discussions. We raised with Ottawa, and they're aware. And members, right though, you know, we need to work a lot closer together with Ottawa, and I think we have a very good working relationship with our federal counterparts. And as far as planning for the next assembly, I mean, usually at the end of a current assembly, there's a transition committee that's formed that provides some advice to the incoming government. Whether they take it or not would be a decision that they make, and that would be an issue, I think, that would be best if we put it forward as advice to the incoming government. Doesn't mean we're not working on it. It's just keep it to the forefront and provide some advice to the next government as to what they need to be thinking as far as increased traffic goes. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for the presentation. I greatly appreciate you guys coming and taking the time here with us today. I guess my first one is just about, it's going to be a bit of a comment, and I'm going to go on to some questions here. So what I'm looking for and what I'm hearing from my small communities and the Nahende riding is strategic spending. We need strategic spending in these small communities, because if we develop our small communities, that helps our regional centers. If it helps our regional centers, it helps the city of Yellowknife, and if it helps the city of Yellowknife, it helps the collective. You know, you put work and employment in the small communities, that means kids are going to school, there's food on the table, and it's huge. And they're off income support, and they're making contributions towards the communities in the region. So I've been hearing that and that. So I guess the question is, yeah, so when we talk about that is, though, how can we start putting more work in these smaller communities? Has the department looked at that or the government looked at that as how we can help that? Because I know they're looking for employment. They're looking for programs to do that. So has the department or finance department asked the other departments to start looking at these things? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Minister McLeod.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the government of Northwest Territories recognizes, as we all do as 19 members, that we need to make investments in a lot of the areas outside the capital, and I think that this government, this assembly, has done a fairly good job in doing that. As the member knows, there is a small community, rural and remote community committee that has come up with some ideas, and we try to bring those forward to the appropriate ministers to see if they could look at some strategic spending. And if you look at the money that's been expended over the life of this government, and I'm going to try and get the breakdown, but I would assume that a lot of it is spent in the small communities trying to create work, diversify the economy. There's been significant investments made in all communities, I like to believe, across Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the Minister for that answer. I agree the government has put money into these communities, and I think we just need to do a better job. I honestly think working together, I think we can move forward. I guess on slide 7, you guys talked about, the Deputy Minister talked about carbon taxes, and, you know, it's neutral. Well, in reality, it isn't neutral for us in the north. We control ours, but if we're bringing the heating fuel, the fuel from down south, there's a carbon tax to that, that, you know, Alberta or BC or somebody puts onto that. And, you know, as a business, you put your costs onto the people. So has the department brought this issue to the Minister of Finance at the federal level and say, look, it's not carbon neutral. It's not neutral. This carbon tax here, we can make it neutral in the Northwest Territories, but when we're shipping goods and that up here, it has huge impact on our residents. So in your conversations, have you brought this issue to the Minister? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Minister McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, when carbon pricing first was being introduced, we had a concern that it was going to affect people in the Northwest Territories, like all people in the Northwest Territories. And because we get a lot of our goods from the southern jurisdictions, we knew that if they had to pay carbon price, it would be tacked on to whatever we paid. I think our government, our assembly, has done a very good job in minimizing the effects that the carbon pricing is going to have on people in the Northwest Territories. We did a public release this summer with our approach to carbon pricing, and I think we've met that challenge, and we continue to raise that with the federal government. And we were going to implement our own Made in the North approach to carbon pricing, whether the federal government liked it or not, because our goal first and foremost is to minimize the effect it was going to have people in the Northwest Territories, and I think we've done a fairly good job with that, and we had the public release this summer. We've had some feedback, but I think for the most part we'll work our way through the carbon pricing and make sure that it doesn't impact residents in Northwest Territories as much as it would have had we used the federal backstop. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. Mr. Thompson, you have one more question if you'd like. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank the Minister for that answer and commitment. I mean, I just hope we're able to get some of those costs back or whatever, and I appreciate the work you guys are doing at the national level on that. So my last question comes back to slide 7, and you talked on here about the annual service payment. The Stanton P3 project will begin in 2019-2020. So with this annual service payment, this is coming out of our O&M, so this is going to be another cost to our program. So how will this have an impact on some of our programs? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Kalgatkar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, as members recall, part of that service payment is also targeted to pay down the long-term debt that's associated with that project. So, even though a lot of the payment, about half of the payment, is in our O&M budget, the part of that is going to be used to pay down the long-term debt, and the impact of that payment has already been built into our fiscal framework. So we were anticipating making that payment when the hospital came into service later this year, and it's been in our forecast for quite a while now. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Kalgatkar. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I want to turn to page or slide 4 of the presentation, and I know there was discussion of this, and certainly in the first 3 years of this assembly we've seen a decline in revenues, and I guess there's some hope that they're going to rebound. But what are we actually doing to stabilize and grow revenues, particularly given the additional jurisdiction authority that we have under devolution? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I think when you look at our revenues and the types of revenues that we generate in the Northwest Territories, and in addition, the overall sort of approach to the formula financing that's been taken by the federal government, having a strong economic base, both through resource extraction, but diversifying the economy, being able to grow the population, which has an impact on our formula with Canada. That's really the keys in terms of the overall revenue situation of the government. If we don't have an economy, I think one of the members mentioned that as mines close and those sorts of things, we face the risk of more population leaving the territory. As population leaves, that obviously impacts our formula. It impacts our own source revenue in terms of the types of taxes that we collect. So that strong economic base, having the residents have the skills and abilities and the education levels to be able to take advantage of that, addressing some of those social challenges, that's really the longer term challenge. But I think a strong economy and residents that are working will do an awful lot for our revenue situation in terms of the key things that government can do to help make sure that we've got the revenues going forward. So, thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Well, I agree with much of what was said. Clearly, the graph here shows that there is challenges around revenues, and the approach of Cabinet has been to limit expenditures rather than really look at how to stabilize and grow revenues. And I've been very critical of this Cabinet for that focus. You know, we signed the devolution deal over 4.5 years ago. Not one word of the mirror legislation or the regulations has been changed in that time. We don't really know or understand whether we're even getting a fair return for the resources that are extracted here. You know, the promise of devolution was that we were going to do things better and differently than the feds, and we haven't really lived up to that promise. So when are we going to take a serious look at the revenues, own source revenues that we get from resource extraction? And I understand that the territorial formula funding has a large role in what we get to keep. But when are we going to have that debate, discussion around whether we're getting a fair return for our resources? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister McLeod.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, when we signed devolution, before we signed devolution, we were getting zero resource royalty. And now we get 50% up to a cap, and then we share that with the Aboriginal governments. And the mining industry are a huge part of the economic in the Northwest Territories. And member's correct, though, we need to continually have a discussion on how we want to improve things. Since devolution, we've taken a couple of first steps, and that discussion continues to be ongoing. And as far as generating more own source revenue, I mean, if there's opportunities for more economic growth, then obviously we'll have more revenue coming from that. So we try to promote some of the economic growth in the Northwest Territories, so that gives an opportunity to create more own source revenue. And but it's an ongoing discussion, and we continue to have those with the Assembly, with the industry, and with our Aboriginal partners. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I think I know what the answer is, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it anyways. Is there going to be a public review of resource revenues from mining, oil and gas during the term of the 18th Assembly to start to get at this issue of revenue growth and improvement, and the promises I think that were made during devolution? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister McLeod.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, my understanding, and I could be corrected, and I will check with the appropriate ministers, that there is no plans to do a public review during the life of this Assembly. We've got about a year left. And again, going back to answering the question before, it could be some advice we provide to the next Assembly, early in the Assembly, maybe have a look at this. So, but member is correct, though, that there is no plan in the life of this Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. You note on page 6 of the presentation deck that according to our last May estimates, our debt is over $1 billion now. And that's a staggering number for a territory of 44,000 people. How does this debt compare to other jurisdictions, the other provinces and territories in Canada? Where do we rank? Thank you. Per capita, how do we rank? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I don't have that data in front of me. I do know that at a general level, our level of debt, and it depends on how you measure it, whether it's per capita, percentage of GDP, percentage of your operating, there's a variety of ways of addressing that. Overall, our debt levels, though, are not as significant as most provinces and territories, certainly when you compare with some of them like Newfoundland or Quebec or those even Ontario. The percentage of their budget that goes towards servicing their debt tends to be in the closer to 10%, where ours is around 1%. So we have high levels of debt, there's no question. We have a small population base, there's no question about that. But relative to our overall revenue side, our debt levels are actually probably amongst the lowest in the country.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Mr. Simpson.
So just by doing the math, it's about $25,000 a person, I think, is what it is. And I think that's pretty comparable to Ontario and to Newfoundland, who have, are in crisis essentially when it comes to their debt. And so maybe we have lower debt servicing limits, but it's still troubling that we have a $1.1 billion debt with 44,000 people. And the territorial formula financing, the Feds say it's a difference between a proxy of the territory's expenditures and the capacity to generate revenues. Essentially, though, the Feds really helped build the infrastructure in southern Canada, the railroad, the Trans-Canada Highway, which allowed the southern provinces to grow and gave them an opportunity for economic growth. We never received that in the territory. So while we might be getting 2 to 3 times equalization, we never got that initial boost from the Feds that we need. And so our formula financing is essentially like income assistance. They're giving us enough just to stay where we are. We're not advancing at the rate we need to, which is it's unfortunate given the size of our territory and the resources we have. We, like my colleague from Hay River says, if we were doing what we could do up here with our resources, we would change Canada's GDP, never mind just the territories. And so I just wanted to highlight that. We're going to get into the details of this budget over the next 2 months that I'm here in Yellowknife. And so I'll leave my comments for then, but I want to highlight that and ensure that that is the message that is going to Ottawa, that we don't just need the territorial formula financing, we need to be treated the same as the rest of the country and given that economic boost so that we can eventually fend for ourselves. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I agree with the member. We have a lot of resources here in the Northwest Territories, and it's a message that I send to Ottawa every meeting that I have, is that we want to be able to contribute to Canada's economy, and we have the land, the resources necessary to do it. But if they continuously try to turn the Northwest Territories and want a giant park for the rest of the country to enjoy, then that puts us in a bit of a spot. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. Mr. Simpson, you can ask another question or make a comment if you'd like. Mr. Simpson?
Sure. My statement wasn't a setup for the minister's comment there, but I appreciate that he's bringing that message forward, and I noted he is, and nothing further right now. Oh, can this deck be made public? Can I share this with my constituents? All right, thank you very much for that. Nothing further.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister McLeod?
Yeah, thank you. I'll say yes publicly instead of just nodding my head. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. Mr. Testard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is an important conversation that we need to continue to have about, the role of the federal government and how our revenues work. And one thing that I've learned from being in this role is that each year when we receive kind of the new budgetary information, it's like shooting in the dark. There's so much volatility in own source revenues and resource royalties that it's very hard to predict stable growth for the Northwest Territories. And largely that's because the resource sector makes up the largest private sector. operations in the Northwest Territories, and that can change up and down. And as we know from economic projections, there isn't much going on in the resource sector, and we're stabilizing that slowdown with a very robust public services sector through the GNWT itself. But as increasing pressure is put on our expenditure growth to invest in infrastructure and programs, we heard it earlier that expenditure growth in supporting the public sector reduces our available resources for other economic priorities and most importantly, infrastructure development. And that's not going to change. You know, we have collective bargaining has reached a critical juncture, and the outcome of that could be a multi-million-dollar expenditure, which again will take away from other available resources. So the best projections we can have is what we receive from Canada, from the grant from Canada, which essentially makes the Northwest Territories a welfare state, and we have to find a way to stabilize the economy and figure this out. And the more we invest in or the more we hold back on those expenditures when economic times are lean, the harder it's going to be to manage our economy and avoid debt, or manage the government's books and avoid debt. We have a new plan for Aurora College, which is also potentially a multi-million-dollar investment. We have billion-dollar projects like the Tallston expansion and Slave Geological Province Road that are transformative in nature and might provide more stability. We just don't have the money to get there. And I guess my question is, we know the diamond mines are shutting down. We've got a 10-year window, and currently the economic management we've seen from this government is to manage what we've got going on, manage our expenditures so we can continue to stay the course. But we haven't seen any transformative measures take place. We haven't seen us move forward. And we've got, again, a public service that's stabilizing the economy while the resource sector is in decline. And this government's acknowledged that it doesn't have the money to invest in the public service to the degree that at least the UNW is asking for. So what is the plan forward here? How are we going to get out of this kind of never-ending cycle of busts in the resource sector, a GNWT that's grown to a point where we can't continue to invest in it because it's too expensive and it limits our other opportunities? What's the government's plan for it, especially when the diamond mines start shutting down in 2025? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testard. Minister McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I think we recognize the importance that resource extraction has in the Northwest Territories. I've seen booms and busts in the oil industry, and I see the economic prosperity that it brings. We've been fortunate in the last few years that we have had diamond mines that are operating in the Northwest Territory. But we recognize that we're still facing challenges, because if you look, and remember from the Hande mentioned it before, the small communities, I mean, there's challenges in the small communities. And we have tried in this assembly and in assemblies past that I've been part of to try and promote economic activity in the Northwest Territories, and it's been a bit of a challenge. I mean, these are businesses. They're in it to try and make a dollar. And if there's opportunities for them to invest in the Northwest Territories, then we would welcome that. But as a government, we need to ensure that we are also investing in the Northwest Territories, and we continue to do that. We've been fortunate. We've been able to have some infrastructure projects the last few years that have helped with that, and we have a fairly aggressive capital budget that we will be debating in the October session, which we would like to think would create, which should create some economic activity and employment in the Northwest Territories. So it's a never-ending challenge for any government in any jurisdiction in the country, and it's how you try and manage it and make sure that there's economic prosperity, but at the same time ensuring that there's also opportunities for a lot of the small communities that you represent. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. One more question, Mr. Testart.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the Minister's response. I mean, of course, managing public policy is always a challenge, and every government has to go through it, and you can see some have done it better than others. We have 67% employment in the Northwest Territories. It's not evenly distributed, but it shows our job creation record as a government is good. But how sustainable are those employment numbers, again, when decreasing revenues mean reductions and restrictions of public sector growth? Again, we're using the government to stabilize our economy, and that's an untenable position to be in the long term. And when those diamond mines close, if we do not have a plan to replace that GDP contribution and the revenues that come from those mines, we are going to start to see layoffs in the public sector because we can no longer support it. And nobody wants to get to that place. And what I hear is, we'll put things in the transition report, we'll put things in, the 19th Assembly will be closer to this position, this eventuality, so they'll have to work on that. I'm saying we need to have more foresight in our budgetary documents now, so we're setting up for the future. And again, we've had restraint and managed reductions for the past 3 years, but we haven't seen substantial growth or the start of new industries or the start of development. We have a robust tourism sector. It's not going to replace mining. Nobody's saying that. And I want to be clear too that resource royalties or the extractive sector needs to stay put, and it needs to be supported by the government. And we need to find ways to ensure that the benefits of that sector come back to Northerners. But we can't wait. We really can't wait. And we also need to, if we're going to, again, use the public sector to support the economy while we're figuring things out or building a new plan forward, then we need to invest in it. So my final question will be, are we going to settle this labor dispute that's affecting, again, a huge chunk of our economy? A very important sector of our economy that has a stabilizing effect on home prices, on commodity prices, on the employment numbers. Are we going to move towards doing this, and are we going to get it done before the next election? Or is this going to be an election issue that we're all going to have to face in 2019? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Minister McLeod.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. On the labor dispute, we did say at the beginning that it was going into mediation. I will comment no further on that. And as far as the economy, a member knows as well as I do, we need to promote investment in Northwest Territories. Again, these are businesses. If there's opportunities for them to invest in Northwest Territories, help grow our economy, then that's something that they make as a business decision. We, as a government, in the last couple of years, I think we made some adjustments, and I think we're positioned this government and hopefully future government with not having as much of a debt load as they would have had we just done nothing. And so I think we've faced that challenge, and government right now in a lot of the communities are one of the major economic drivers. Unfortunately, tourism is picking up. We've seen it up in the Bodell. But we have to continue to position ourselves where we're able to take advantage of infrastructure investments in the Northwest Territories, and I think we've answered that challenge, and we're able to match a lot of federal infrastructure dollars without adding to our debt. So it's a challenge, and we continue to have to sometimes make adjustments to meet those challenges. Again, we can't tell industry to come to the Northwest Territories. We can promote the Northwest Territories as a good place to invest, but at the end of the day, it's a business decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. We're moving into a second round of questions, so I have 2 questions for everyone. Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, my question for the Minister is about revenue generation. 2 years ago, he tabled a revenue options paper that looked at different kinds of revenue generation, such as introducing a high-income tax bracket, increasing the payroll tax, corporate tax, and so on. And I'm wondering what work is going on with looking at revenue generation in any of the areas that were covered in that paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So as the member noted, we laid out a variety of options in terms of things that could be looked at. We have certainly examined some of those areas in terms of their potential and the impact of that. Obviously, things like the carbon pricing and the increase in the tax burden there is something that we have to think about in terms of the overall tax on individuals. The challenge to some degree is how do you find any sort of measure that raises a significant enough set of revenues that makes it worth putting in place. We also have had a couple of other potential initiatives around revenue generation. One of them, of course, was the sugary drink tax, and we are planning to have some public consultation on that in the coming months, and then make a decision. The Assembly will need to make a decision on whether they go forward with that or not. But even that one is very, very modest, and yet there are certainly pockets of significant resistance to the idea of a sugary drink tax. So these are all challenging ones. Anytime you raise a revenue, nobody likes to be taxed more, so those are challenging issues, but it's certainly something we have to continue to look at as we go forward.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Stewart, for that response. I think that the carbon tax has been described as neutral, so I don't think we're talking about the carbon tax. But the tax and the corporate tax, even with modest increases, could generate millions of dollars more per year without making us uncompetitive with other northern jurisdictions. So I'm wondering why those increases are not in play. And then finally, about the high income tax bracket, 25% of the households in the NWT earn over $200,000 a year. So there is a group there of high income earners who are very well compensated, who could afford to pay more tax. So are you looking at those modest increases for payroll tax and corporate tax, or creating a high income tax bracket? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Mr. McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, it's not something that we're looking at right now. I mean, as Finance Minister, I have been reluctant to impose a tax, be it personal income tax or because I think someone made the comment before, we are taxed enough. And the high income earners too. I mean, that would be awfully difficult because of all people in the Northern Territories, the high income earners have the ability to move about the country. And if we start imposing a higher tax bracket onto them, then if there's opportunities to move to other jurisdictions, they may do that. And we've had concerns with the population of the Northwest Territories. So I've been very hesitant to impose personal taxes and that on folks in the Northwest Territories because folks are challenged enough in the Northwest Territories as it is with the high cost of living. So we've been trying to neutralize that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my first question is in regards to the ruling from the Supreme Court, in April 2016 with the Métis, and about the rights and responsibilities. I know that GNWT has been covering these costs for ever and ever, but so has the government been working with the federal government to get that money back? I mean, realistically, we can't go back from the statement, but can the minister please advise, what the status is on this?
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Minister McLeod.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not quite sure on the details of that. My understanding is they may be having discussions, and that would probably be a question better posed to the Department of Health and Social Services when they appear before committee with their business plans. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and that actually sees me because I can go back to the question, the other question I wanted to ask about the Staten Hospital P3. When your assistant deputy minister talked about it and the government has a plan on it, I was asking the question: does these payments have an impact on our programs, or will they have an impact on these programs, our programs that are being offered by the government? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Minister McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, they won't. We were aware that these payments were going to be coming, so they were built into the budgeting process, and the programs and services still continue to go on, so they won't have. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm looking at the overall current picture from when we started, when the 18th Assembly started, where we're projecting to go with the financial strategy. And I'm kind of liking what I see, as I mentioned yesterday. To give you an example on employment opportunities and healthy living in the small communities, if we look back on revenue generating initiatives and supporting and coming out with a position to maintain industry's presence, let us just look at the repair initiative of Line 21's application. So it went from zero revenue from the Norman Wells flow of oil to a contribution through a repair program to now a transportation repaired system, which is going to see the increase in royalties as well as employment. And your O&M capital initiatives is really contributing to the community of the surrounding communities as well as the community of Norman Wells. If we look at the relocation or the rehire of industry's presence because of that repair program and our measures to support industry during the permitting process, we've seen I've seen employment raised with Imperial Oil for 32 positions. And our government, with the presence of an updated healthcare building, creating an additional 25 positions. So we have seen 57 positions. And I throw out a suggestion here on building Aboriginal partnerships through a diversified initiative. And if we look to take as an example one of the chapters of the Satu land claim underneath the permitted activities chapter, and we say, okay, well, we'll partner with you, and the end product would be to have a position of resource development. You pay half and I'll pay half. And let's take the mineral strategy. Okay, if the initiative of both parties through your bilateral discussions twice a year with the SSI party and say, listen, maybe if you take a part of the devolution share that you're getting and pay 50% of the strategy and I'll pay the other half, now at the end of the day we have a resource development strategy in that area contributed by resource revenue funds going to both parties of devolution, this government and the regional government. So I just throw that out as a joint idea to keep moving towards maintaining and opening up lands for resource development. And on the issue of the carbon tax, I'm hoping that these bilateral agreements would entertain, as one of my previous colleagues mentioned, our resources are coming up from the south, and if you look at the retail price in Norman Wells for gas, it's $1.90.4. It was $1.94. So you don't want to look at your statement if you fill up your truck in that regard compared to the prices here. So if that product's coming and dictated by the Strathcona refinery outside of Edmonton here for the private sector, I'm hoping our government, because your government or our government sees a share of those excise taxes. And that might be an issue to put on the table for the upcoming bilateral agreements with SSI. So I just point that out. And on top of that, the last thing we want to see is a carbon tax on top of that $1.90 per liter. It's bad enough as it is. And, you know, we discuss avenues or concepts or innovations here for raising revenues. And we also talk about getting prepared for the decline in the diamond mine sector. But yet we're making it more difficult to maintain industry's presence by giving them affordable access. If you can be flexible in that area, but still viewed on the positive concept of balanced, responsible development, that would give us a reason to say, yes, industry, we'll meet you halfway. We'll give you an affordable access. But at the same token, we don't want 100% finance it, including the cost of capital to do so. So I just throw that out, and it's my statements are more of a comment. But overall, I look at the picture, and I'm satisfied where we're going. And I know you're taking extra steps to maintain and balance the debt by your continued dialogue with Ottawa. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. And if anyone's worried about the noises, there's some building improvements going on, and we have asked them to take their lunch break, so we should have a quiet meeting for the remainder of the proceedings. Mr. McNeely, that was a comment, but Minister McLeod, if you'd like to respond. Okay. We'll move on to our next. Did you have a question, Mr. McNeely?
No, it wasn't a comment, it was several comments.
Correct. Your manifesto has been well received. Mr. Van Thun, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's a lot of important points being raised today, and I think that bodes well for how important it is to have this kind of a setting, and that we should do more of it in terms of to help fulfill that communications and public consultation piece as it relates to the government's budgets, and just recognize the impacts that it has on our society and our territory. Minister, at the forefront, of course, is our ability to afford to even live here and work here and do business here. I'd be remiss if I didn't raise some points as it relates to what is it that our government is doing to lower the costs of living for Northerners, for those that are currently living here and those that are currently trying to make their way here in the Northwest Territories. This discussion earlier about taxes, and you know, I'm sorry, but I've always taken the position I will never accept introducing new taxes. Even the neutralized carbon tax is a very difficult one for me to swallow. We've increased power rates in the Northwest Territories by 40% nearly over in the last 7 years. Airport fees have been implemented, forthcoming carbon taxes, one that we already pay from Alberta. There was talk about a land transfer tax. Residents who own properties pay increased property taxes. There's talk about federal adjustment on small business taxes. I mean, if we want to get more revenues relating to taxes, well, then what we need to do is create more jobs, create more taxpayers is what we need to do. And so, what I would like to do, ask the minister is, what are we going to do in terms of strategic investments that will actually lower the cost of living, where people can feel it in their pocketbooks? Because the saddest day for me is when I get those emails from residents that say, we're done. We're literally packing the truck up right now and leaving, and I wanted you to know that because I can't afford to live here anymore, and my dollar stretches further in the south. So I think people deserve to know what it is that we're going to strategically do to lower the costs of living, and I would like to hear the government's position on that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Minister McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, appreciate the members' comments, first of all. And I think it's creating an economy and creating jobs, and as the members said, that creates taxpayers, and that will increase, should increase our revenue. As we all know, we always had an issue in the Northwest Territories with the high costs of living. You feel it here in the capital, well, double it, maybe triple the feeling of the high cost of living, and then you'll know what it feels like to be in one of the smaller communities, especially some of the high Arctic communities. And so they're faced with the challenge. The government has a lot of programs to help with the high cost of living, especially in a lot of the smaller communities. I mean, unfortunately, income support is one of them. We have a lot of subsidies within the government to try and help with the high cost of living. But the member hit the nail on the head when he said before, create more taxpayers. And I think by promoting economic investment, economic diversification in Northwest Territories, unfortunately, high cost of living is just a challenge that we all face in Northwest Territories, and there's things that the government can do to help mitigate that, and that's why we fought so hard on the carbon pricing, is to try not to have that type of a impact on residents in the Northwest Territories. And I think if you see the plan that we laid out when we rolled out our approach to carbon pricing, I think we've met that challenge. But it's an ongoing battle. It's been something that's been going on in the Northwest Territories for as long as I can remember, and we just have to keep plugging along, and again, creating more taxpayers by creating more economic activity, I think is a good step. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. Van Thyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the Minister's reply. I mean, yes, creating the jobs and creating the taxpayers is a critical piece. But as I mentioned, I mean, these people that are sending me these messages aren't unemployed. These are employed people. And you're right, they're not even feeling the pinch that you would feel if you're in one of the more remote communities. These are people that actually have the option to make the decision to leave. There's many people who can't. And so even if we had a lot of opportunities and a lot of jobs here, I think people really want the government to communicate to them what it is that they are doing to legitimately lower the costs of living. They want to hear about things like net metering programs, and they want to hear about those things that we are doing, like the changes to the Cities, Towns and Villages Act that will allow municipalities to apply local improvement charges so that people can get some rebates back when they do energy efficiency improvements on their home, kinds of things. But those are the real difference makers. Those are the things that, well, we've done a good job as a government to pad our own pockets in recent years because we've had to do that. I appreciate that we've stabilized our expenditures, but we continue to have revenue dropping. If people have more disposable income in their pocket, they're going to get out into the market and they're going to dispense that money, and it's going to start flowing around. But if they got to pay nearly 40 cents a kilowatt hour for power when the South charges 4 or 8, then the decision's already made. They can only live here for so long, and then they've crossed a threshold and they have to leave. And so I just would make a comment then that I want the government to really take the position going forward into this next budget cycle and beyond about living up to our mandate, where we clearly state that we will lower the costs of living. And take that to heart, and I look forward to debating the budget and making sure that we can implement those things. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. Okay, Minister does not wish to respond. Mr. O'Reilly, you have the floor. Oh, sorry, Minister McLeod does wish to respond. Go ahead, Minister.
No, actually, the Minister took that as a comment. It's not that I did not wish to respond. I took that as a comment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister, for the clarification. Comment received. Mr. O'Reilly, you have the floor.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I don't want to get into a debate, but I think we need a fair tax system, and we don't have one. And there's lots of room for improvement. But I do want to talk about creating the kind of economy that my colleague talked about. And the areas of our economy that have been growing, and I want to give some credit to Cabinet and working with regular MLAs. We do have an agricultural strategy. We have a manufacturing strategy that's in development. We have some plans for rejuvenating the fishery. The one area, though, that I really don't have a clear sense of where we're going with is tourism. And, we can see the benefits of tourism right here in Yellowknife. There's 50,000 tourists that come through Yellowknife now, and we don't have a visitor center that's really up to snuff. And I don't understand the reluctance of ITI to actually invest in a tourism center here in Yellowknife, but we also have tremendous opportunities, even in a place like Delaney, where they're going to have, and thanks to our colleague from the Sawtoo and the work that people have done there, people visiting directly from China. So that we have tremendous potential in the tourism sector, but our government just doesn't seem to be ready to invest any more in that. And if we are serious about diversifying our economy, stabilizing revenues, life after diamonds, which is what I've heard at the door when I just went around my riding, people are concerned about that, life after diamonds. We don't really have a plan, as my colleague from Cam Lake talked about. Where's our government going with tourism and creating and supporting the areas of our economy that are actually growing now? Thanks.
Minister McLeod.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I agree with the member that tourism is growing. It's actually growing. They've seen that in, if you read the articles on the news there from Tuktoyaktuk and the benefits of the Nuvik Highway. They expect 5,000 visitors this year. The community's been doing a good job locally trying to take on the influx of tourists. I don't think they realized there was going to be that many, but it's been a bit of a challenge for them. But knowing the people of Tuktoyaktuk, they're up to that, and then there's a part to play for the government too. And I think we recognize that there's a part that we have to play in making sure that some of the facilities are in some of these regions. I can't speak to the visitor center or what ITI may want to do as far as the Nuvik Highway and the tourism influx of visitors to Tuktoyaktuk, but that'll be a question that's probably better proposed to ITI as they come forward with their business plan. But I do know that they have been promoting tourism, and it's grown at a rate where I think as a government we need to step up and make sure that we have all the available facilities. Again, I'm not going to speak to what they're proposing. I'll let the Minister of ITI do that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. O'Reilly?
No.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Bolio?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I just maybe make some comments or ask some questions on resource development. I know that what's happening, and seems obvious that there's going to be a bit of scaling down in the diamond mining industry, and then eventually to shut down the diamond mining industry in the Northwest Territories. But there are many other possibilities in mining. We talk a few years back, there was a lot of talk with Fortune Minerals. That was something that now may be possible to seek an investment through the road into Wati, which makes it, I think, more feasible for investors at Fortune Minerals. We had previously had a lot of discussions of a mine that's in Tuneda Williday, and that was the Avalon, which there's an exploration camp in there, and there's a lot of potential gold exploration right around YK, and of course there's Pine Point Mines, which is right next door to the community I represent at Fort Resolution. I'd like to ask the government if the government would look towards these exploration companies to see how far advanced they are and what they need in order to move forward with actual mining. An example is that Avalon, I do believe, unless someone can prove me wrong, that it's probably the richest rare metals mine in the world. And so I'd like to know if the government has contacted these companies to see what they can do to make it possible for these guys to move forward with mining. Thank you.
Minister McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, my understanding is the government usually has conversations with a lot of folks from the industry who are looking to invest in lots of territories, and I know for a fact that they've had some meetings with the industry representatives. If they have some concerns or if they feel that there's ways that we can help them with the process, they usually give us an update, and I will undertake to see when the last updates we had were, and if it's possible, I can share them with members of committee. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the Minister for that response. My second question is, it's a little bit different, of course, from the first one. I've talked about the potential that we have here in the city of Yellowknife of having a nursing school. Similar to a medical school down south, like the University of Alberta Hospital and so on, was the old Stanton Hospital, which is geared to become a long-term care facility. I see that as a golden opportunity for the government to have a nursing school to train home care workers. I spoke many times in the House about home care workers and the work they could do. We could hire home care workers in practically every community, and they almost immediately pay for themselves. An average home care worker is able to work on at least three or four households. For each person that remains outside of long-term care as they age, for each person that remains outside of long-term care, as I said many times, at today's dollars is about $140,000 per year. So imagine if one home care worker is able to keep 4 elders out of, or senior people including Yellowknife, of course, out of long-term care for 10 years. So we're talking about $5.6 million savings over a 10-year period, and would cost nowhere near that amount for the Department of Health to hire home care workers to give the support to the elders to remain in their homes, and also have the Housing Corporation creates some employment in the community through the Housing Corporation to make sure those units are barrier-free so the elders can remain in their homes a lot longer. I'm wondering if there's ever been any sort of serious discussion about the member statement I made on this in, I think, the last session or a session previous, about having a nursing school, having the old Stanton Hospital turned into a nursing school. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Minister McLeod.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, my understanding is most of the space in the old Stanton Hospital has already been spoken for, right? I take the member's point, and you would like to see more opportunities like that for anyone to take up nursing if they choose to. And so obviously the member will have a discussion with the Minister of Health when his term comes, or his time comes before committee. But my understanding is most of those spaces are spoken for. As far as elders, I mean, it's recognized that the elder population is growing. I think the government has taken significant steps into trying to keep as many elders in their home community as possible with the investments made in some of the elders facilities in the community. I think there was 5 that went up in the last couple of years. I know one is still being worked on for quite a while. And then we have some long-term care facilities going into some of the larger centers. And as far as the home care workers, they had a good program at the college in Inuvik a few years ago where they had a number of Bodell people graduate from the home care workers, and a lot of them are employed. Some are employed in the community actually providing home care. So it was an excellent program, and there was a good success rate of graduates there. So it's something that they'll continue to promote. And as more long-term care facilities come online, then there's going to be opportunities for more training for home care workers. But the government does recognize and try keep the elders in the communities as long as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my last question or comments are on the recent foundational review that occurred for Aurora College and some of the recommendations made about a polytechnical university here in Yellowknife to get more into the post-secondary education for students in the Northwest Territories. But what's left behind in Fort Smith is what I want to speak on. I believe that Fort Smith Arctic College, Aurora College in Fort Smith and Inuvik and whatever Aurora College remains here in Yellowknife, they should start looking at a trade center. I think that there's a tremendous potential. I think Fort Smith initially started as sort of like a trade center, as it used to be called a adult vocational training center, and they used to train tradespeople and also heavy equipment operators and so on. So I'd like to see the expansion of that into a trade center. But the big item, I believe, is a conservation school. I think that earlier, I know that the minister mentioned about the conservation areas that the federal government wishes to create across the territory. I believe across the country. Sorry, not the territory. Across the country, of about 17% of the space to be under some sort of protected area. I believe that is a golden opportunity for us to train conservation officers. I think that right now we have people in training through the ENR. They have a NTR ENR program. I think that there's an opportunity to train guardians of the land. There's many guardians of the land, and there's also opportunities to train rangers and many people right in Fort Smith. And I think that the federal government has made a strong indication that they want to see something like that. They put $1.3 billion in the budget last year towards the conservation of the country, and I think that there would be a real opportunity if like right now, I think the community of Fort Smith is hurt by what was reported and what was said in a foundational review. I think there's an opportunity to really go in there and make Fort Smith even more involved in education of people of the territories and other neighboring jurisdictions as well. If there could be, I don't think there is a conservation school of that type. There might be something in British Columbia. I haven't fully researched what I heard about that, something that's, I believe, on the island down there, but I think that would be another opportunity. I'd like to ask the Minister if there's any discussion about what they're going to replace Aurora College as it exists today with something else in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Minister McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, my understanding is that decision has not been made on the foundational review. They're still evaluating the recommendations that are coming out of that. The member has come up with actually some really good ideas. I mean, what we'd like to see in the Northwest Territories is 3 strong campuses in the Northwest Territories, and some of the ideas that the member is pitching, I think, make absolute sense. And it's information like that we would take to Cabinet or to the decision makers and see if there is possibilities on the conservation area. Never thought of that before. The member's right, though. Canada wants 17% of the country turned into a giant park. We have some candidate areas in the Northwest Territories, and if all these candidate areas were to become parks, then we'd be at our 17%. And so there's still work going on that. But again, at the end of the day, we'd like to see 3 strong campuses offering programs that are beneficial in today's market. And so I think it's a very good idea, and I'm sure the member and committee and as an assembly will continue to have those discussions. But my understanding is there's no decision made yet on the findings of the foundational review, and they're still evaluating the recommendation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Minister. Mr. Bolio. Thank you, Mr. Bolio. Ms. Green, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'd like to ask some questions about the growth, specifically that the amount of money that is allocated to forest growth in this budget is much less than it's been in previous years, down by 1/3, and that's despite the fact that there can be anticipated growth from the settlement with youth and retroactive pay, whatever that ends up looking like. So I'm wondering how this small forest growth number was arrived at. Thank you.
Ms. Green, that information is not before committee in the public hearing. So I will, the minister doesn't have to respond, and he is well, I'll let him speak for himself. Minister?
Yeah, the chair is absolutely correct, and I will take the chair's advice and save my comments for when we have our briefing with committee.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. And a word on process, there will be an in-camera hearing afterwards. We'll get into more of the details. But the specific details are not on the before committee at this time. Ms. Green?
Thank you for that clarification. I have a more general question. While the minister and others have deplored the idea of increasing taxes, we've had substantial increases in fees during the life of this assembly. For example, the airport tax that we're now all paying to fly in and out of Yellowknife. I'm wondering if there are additional fee increases that are being contemplated. Another one that comes to mind is the land tax. It went up by hundreds of percent this spring. We used to pay $240 a year. We're paying $840 a year. So are there fee increases on the horizon? Thank you.
Minister McLeod.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will save my answers for the in-camera discussion.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Minister. Ms. Green, anything further?
It sounds like I'm not asking questions that are acceptable, so I have nothing further.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Green. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about what Mr. Van Thyn and I believe Mr. O'Reilly touched on, and it was growing the population, and the minister touched on it as well, and the challenges we face growing our population. And I agree with Mr. Van Thyn. There are people leaving the NWT and on the verge of leaving the NWT. Even in Hay River, where we are poised to see significant growth in the next few years, I have people telling me that they are leaving, they're selling their house, and I have other people telling me they're ready to shut their business down. We have a number of seniors who are leaving, not because they don't love the NWT, not because they don't have family here, but because there's not appropriate housing for them. And I don't mean subsidized housing, I mean market housing. And the town has no lots to sell to build these houses on. You know, by the government's own estimates, Hay River is looking at hundreds of jobs in the coming years. And that could be thousands of people coming to the territory if they bring their families. But as it is, our housing market's too small to serve the current job market. We don't have enough homes for all the jobs we have. And as a result, people are moving to Hay River, which affects government services because a lot of these positions are in the health center. And it affects private companies' ability to grow, as well as the GNWT's bottom line. That's $33,000 a person. And so I encourage the government to work with the town of Hay River, work with the Housing Corporation, work with MACA to address these kinds of issues, because there's money sitting there. And it's not stuff we have to work hard for. We don't have to build a road in uncharted territory, to make this happen. It's low-hanging fruit. Over the summer, half a dozen business owners in Hay River, and that's not an exaggeration, half a dozen small business owners with businesses of varying sizes have told me that they're ready to pack up and leave the territory. One reason was a couple of people said labor shortage. They can't find people. And that's people from general laborers who are going to show up to work to people who are qualified to manage job sites and run offices. And while the high cost of doing business is always a factor, it's also the way the GNWT deals with small business. I won't say that there's a war on small business, but I won't say that the GNWT is making the development of small business a priority. And so while the budget is dollars and cents, operationally we have to do a lot better when it comes to dealing with small business. And we can't keep acting like we're doing small business a favor. Like, we're going to be debating the infrastructure budget in the coming sitting here. And as always, there's a lot of money involved in that. And we have to figure out how the government can utilize that to help grow small businesses. And, maybe working with northern businesses costs a few dollars more, but what does it add to the community? It keeps jobs in the community, keeps money in the territory. And so that's something we have to look at. And unless we make those sort of operational changes, we're going to keep going down the same track. And pretty soon, once we get an increase in our borrowing limit, we'll have $2 billion of debt. So those are things that really need to be addressed. And if the minister would like to comment, I welcome it, but I understand that was more of a comment than a question. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Simpson, Minister McLeod.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I take the member's point. I think the government has, I'm not saying we're doing small business a favor, but I think government does support small business to the extent that we can. And but if the member feels that there's more that we need to do, I'd love to hear some ideas. And on the people leaving because of, well, land availability, I think is something that I've heard in the members' community. And a good part of the reason here, I'm not sure how much of that land is tied up in withdrawn land claim negotiations. Those need to be taken care of. If there's available municipal land around the community that needs to be developed, then we need to have a conversation with MAC. But I take the member's point. I mean, I come from a community too as well that has seen its fair share of people leaving the community when natural gas goes from $19 a gigajoule to $39 a gigajoule. Don't stand down by Airport Road because people are leaving in a hurry. And it's unfortunate, but it's some of the challenges we face, and it affects businesses in the small community too, and they have to pass on their cost to the consumers. So it does have an effect. But the one in the members community specifically, I probably would like to hear more on the lack of land, especially that's available in around the community. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. O'Reilly, you have the floor.
Thanks. One additional question that I wanted to ask the minister about. There's been some discussion about cost of living here, and the minister knows that I regularly ask him about what kind of progress we're making with the federal government on the Northern Resident Tax Deduction. We did see an increase in that with the current federal government, but it hasn't been indexed, and that's part of the mandate, is indexing that so that it does increase over time. There was also some information data that came out over the summer about those pesky audits of Northerners, because we continually, or we experience a higher rate of audits than anybody else in Canada because of us having to try to guess about what the travel rates are. So what kind of progress are we making on that specific area with the federal government? And the minister knows I've raised this in the last 3 budgets, whatever, and I'll keep going, but and I think there's opportunities for us to work together with Yukon and Nunavut on this and bring some considerable pressure on the federal finance minister. So can you tell us what kind of progress is being made? Thanks.
Minister McLeod.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with the member. I mean, people in the Northwest Territories are being audited at a higher rate, and I think we heard that. I think our MPs raised it as well with his federal counterparts, and of all of us in here, I'm not sure how many have got audited, because so there's a few of us, and that's not a representation of the Northwest Territories, but I do know a number of people that have gotten audited, and so we've raised it with the federal minister as something that we'd like to discuss, and I'll have Mr. Sturt expand on it further, because he has also had some discussions at the officials level, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. Stewart, you may proceed.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So we actually had CRA officials meeting with us last week. At the Director General level, there was a couple of them. We certainly raised the issues. As you know, they've announced that they're going to be open an office here in Yellowknife. We encouraged them on a couple of things on the office, and one of them was to make sure that they fund it at a level that they can get out to the regions and communities. There's a couple of issues. The other issues that we raised were certainly exactly what the member talked about, the level of and the degree to which there seems to be audits taking place with Northern residents, and the data supports that it is at a much higher rate than elsewhere. The federal minister at the time of the announcement of the office certainly made some commitments around looking into that. The other issue we raised with them is around the Northern residents deduction, and particularly around the travel component of that, and the importance of trying to simplify the rules around that. Recognizing it is their program, we all live with it, and we all know the challenges around that, and I think they got that message. Finally, we did mention around the indexing and the importance of that to be able to keep up, and the fact that it had been many years between when it was established and when they increased. Although we appreciate the increase, we're going to start to get behind again. Of course, they took all that in without any commitments, but I think they have certainly gotten the message loud and clear, both at the political level and at the public service level, that this is an issue that the North feels pretty passionately about. They are coming for a public session in November, I believe. I told them they should expect it to be well attended, and that the GNWT would certainly be there as well to reinforce the points that we did in the meeting we had privately. So thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stewart. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So when we talk about trying to get people into the North and that, I've been dealing with a constituent issue about trying to have somebody come in the North, and it's the regulations there and some of the challenges that, getting a work visa or extending a work visa seems to be very difficult outside of Yellowknife. If you're in the hospitality environment in Yellowknife, they have an exemption to it, but if it's outside outside of the regions or outside of the communities, it's not as feasible. So has the government been looking at trying to get the rules or this special agreement they have with Yellowknife to be expanded out to the smaller communities. Because if we're trying to get people into the communities to do jobs and that, and to work and that, right now there's a hindrance to it. We're now probably 4 months into it from the time after the federal government said no, you can't do it. Now 4 months later, here's the situation, and they still haven't resolved it. But they say the exemption, if it was in Yellowknife, would have been done with right away. So has the government had any of these conversations with the minister and the MP on this? Because I mean, if we're trying to get residents, people here to live in the north, we need to make sure we get the work visas and stuff like that, especially if we're looking at people from outside of the country. So have you guys been in conversations on this? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Minister McLeod, you may proceed, but I will yield the chair back to Mr. Beaulieu at this time. Go ahead, Mr. Minister.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. As a finance minister, I've not had these discussions with my federal counterpart, but and I can't speak for the Minister of Education. They may have had those. They may have had those discussions. It is a federal program, as the member said, and so not much we can do. We can try and help, and we can try to bring attention to it. But at the end of the day, it's a federal program, and I will have a conversation with the Minister of Education to see if they have brought that issue forward with their federal counterpart. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. Mr. Thompson, you're done. We have no one left on the list. I'd like to ask the minister if he has any closing remarks. Minister McLeod.
I'll just thank committee for their time and thank the members of the public that were here. I think we've had a fairly good discussion, and I appreciate the members not going too much into detail, asking fairly general questions, and I look forward to the next round of discussions that we're going to have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. I'd like to thank you and your staff that are with you here today. I'd like to thank the public and the media for attending the committee proceedings. And I'd like to advise people that the public meeting has now come to a close, and I'd like to ask the public and the media to now leave the meeting room. Thank you very much.